I've known Jacqueline for a few years now, and I'm always fascinated by her engagement and thought process towards making sure that we consider the people side of anything that we do. I know she's been around a few different countries and worked in a few different places, but she's now quite settled down in London, southwest Ontario, and she's actually been a great volunteer for ACMP Toronto. I'm not going to read out all the spiel up there. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can pause it at this point in time and read it yourself, or you can read it quickly now while we're doing this. And then Paul, who I've known for maybe a year or so longer than that, but I've always been impressed by Paul's balance of the actual analytical and the emotional side in everything he gets involved with. His passion for bringing in leadership into the change space as well is undisputed. And I know that you'll kind of recognize a similar-ish part of the world accent when he starts speaking as well, but that's purely coincidental. I've only known Paul since I've been in Canada, but I'm actually really thrilled to have him contributing to Jacqueline's contributions tonight in the conversation. It's going to be a great partnership between the two of them. I also want to point out that we do have a duo, and it's our only duo that we have out of all the sessions we have. So hopefully we will have a seamless transitions between the two folks here. But if we do get any technical challenges, I apologize in advance as we go through this stuff, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed it's all's working. So that wraps up my kind of side of things. I'm going to be passing over for the technology to be picked up by Paul to start getting the presentation ready at this point in time. And I'll be putting myself on mute, and I might contribute at various points along the way, whether it's through the chat box or verbally. But otherwise, it is now time for Paul and Jacqueline to take us away for the next hour and share your thoughts with us. So thank you very much. Over to you guys.
Rich, how do I follow that? Don't know how to follow that. Thank you. I would just point out I am from the UK. Rich is from Wales, so no history lessons needed today. But thanks for the blocking me into the same country that you're from. Really, really excited to be here. This is a phenomenal subject to get our teeth into, especially given where we are with COVID-19 and everything that's happening around the world. I am Paul McCarthy, and I'll try not to swear as well. So, as I know this is being recorded. So, as Rich gave an introduction to who we are, I actually met Jacqueline through an ACMP event a few years ago. And, you know, I've been working in change for 20 odd years and have worked with hundreds of different clients all around the world in all different sectors. And we know that, you know, I know, and everyone around this call knows that change can be challenging. Going through any organizational change, whether you're a change practitioner, whether you're a client, whether you're an organization, in fact, just as a human being, it's a challenging process. And I've been doing this stuff for long enough that I've experienced every sort of challenge that people display in change. And I have to admit, I've been quite naive and ignorant of the role that loss and grief plays in how we go through change. And by my own admission, you'll hear from me throughout in terms of stories and, you know, anecdotal stuff, as well as Jacqueline's experience too. We have a tendency, or I have had a tendency, to push people through to get them to where we want to go to as quickly as possible, because we're on the client's dime, and we know this is efficient and effective. And by my own admission, I've not taken the time to really understand that loss and grief are two instrumental pieces to us being able to understand how people go through change. And when I met Jacqueline a couple of years ago now, I think it was, she really opened my eyes to this concept. And I've had a complete paradigm shift, because I now have some different insights into how I personally can help people through change. And, you know, I wouldn't have had that had I not stumbled upon Jacqueline at this conference, and we've had the opportunity to get to know each other since. And this work is really fascinating. So I am not the expert in this subject. Jacqueline is very much the pending expert in this subject, and everything that we talk about tonight will be very much new ground, I think, for a lot of us. And what we want to do is really just create the conditions to have that kind of conversation. So that's what the session's about. It's not just for practitioners. It's not just for people in the audience who are clients. It's for everyone, really, and how we actually go through change itself. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got the screen. So Rich has already gone through a lot of this stuff. Hopefully you can all see this. Rich has already gone through the timing and the way that we're going to unfold this session. A few areas just to note here on our side is that every now and then you're going to see grey slides, and that's either Jacqueline or myself asking you for your reflections or your comments about something. We very much want to practice what we preach. We don't want to be one of those teams that work together and say we encourage questions throughout, and then when you ask a question, we don't answer it or we don't address it. So we want to make this a conversation very much. So when you see a grey slide, know that it's for you. It's designed for you, and we want your input. And also, as Rich mentioned, with the chat box, we're going to have that going throughout. We're going to have that monitored throughout. So if there's anything that you want to put in the chat box to draw our attention to, then we've got someone in our ear, technologically speaking, who will draw our attention to it so we can have a conversation about that. And as we say that, someone's just chat boxed me. And then, oh, Mike, thanks. Awesome. I know it's 5 o'clock. It's towards the evening time. Some of you got your cameras on. Some of you got your cameras off. Completely up to you if you want to show us your faces. I dressed up for this because I was told to, but don't really have anything underneath this for pajamas, really. But so if you want to put your cameras on, please do. No pressure. So in terms of where we're going, what we really want to achieve from this session, I think we have really 3 fundamental goals. We want to really provide some insights into a field that really hasn't been studied that much in the world of change before. We want to show you some things that we've experienced, some things that Jacqueline's uncovered, and really how some of this stuff can help us for the second goal here, to support us in how we actually deliver work. A lot of us deal with organizational change. In fact, a lot of us deal with resistance, and we know that that's only one part of organizational change, of course. But we want to kind of show how understanding loss and grief can actually also help when we're moving stakeholders through a change process. So as part of resistance management, and to show you how that could actually be effective. The other thing we want to do is we recognize that this is a new area in the world that we work in. We want to create a community of practice, if you like, some type of ecosystems for everybody listening to this call, and in fact, everybody else going forward, into how loss and grief can be integrated into how we plan for, how we deliver, and really most importantly, how we sustain organizational change in our organizations. So we've got those three goals. I really want to stress as well, and I know that Jacqueline will too, we're not therapists. We are not neuroscientists. We acknowledge that this is a really dense subject in terms of there's a lot of information out there, and therefore the material that we discussed tonight is really from the lens of organizational change. We're not purporting ourselves to be therapists or neuroscientists, although Jacqueline herself has got a very interesting background and future in the area. But we want to acknowledge that what we've been doing is just consolidating a bunch of material that's already out there. It's quite fragmented across various disciplines like developmental psychology, organizational behavior, change management, and tantology, which for those who don't realize what that is, it's the study of death. And all of those different unique disciplines has basically been the work that Jacqueline has done over the last year or so to pull this together. And therefore, we don't want to purport that we're experts in the field in terms of from a therapeutic perspective. The value that we want to get from this session is simply having a conversation with you to show you a new approach that you might think about using the next time you look at how you take stakeholders through change, by having a better understanding of what they're going through. And not just looking at it from a classic change management perspective, but actually incorporating the role that loss and grief play. So without further ado, can you see that grey slide? Everyone can see it? Great. Jacqueline, that's your cue to basically get into the meat and the content of all this, really.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Before we go on, I just wanted to give a special shout out to Jordan Harold, actually, who is a founding partner at Impact Culture, and who listened to my crazy ideas for the first time in November of last year and said, you need to do something with that. So Jordan, I did something with that, and thanks very much. So let's move on. So as Paul mentioned, today we're going to be talking about loss and grief in the context of organizational change. While everyone realizes that changes mean, leaving the old behind and moving toward the new, we haven't really considered what that means in terms of letting go of an attachment and having your brain navigate the new situation to move to a new situation. So to begin with, I'd just like to take a quick poll to see if anyone has ever considered loss and grief in the context of understanding why people display negative behaviors, including resistance to organizational change. Just answer in the chat box or just shout it out.
Do you need anything from me at this point, or people can unmute themselves if they want to
or just answer?
Okay.
So we've seen this play out in the workplace. Loss, grief. Oh, I'm so glad that someone mentioned bridges. We're going to come back to that.
Jacqueline, I certainly have. I never had a label for it. I just like lots of change, and then all of a sudden I'm in a mood for a long time, and I have no idea why.
That is such a critical comment, Manny, because the majority of us experience grief, but we don't have the language around it. And until I really studied this, I didn't have the vocabulary to describe what was going on with my body. So thank you for mentioning that. I think we've all experienced grief following change, but we don't recognize it. And even if we recognize that we're feeling crappy, we don't talk about it because we feel that we shouldn't. So, because no one else does. I mean, we didn't actually have somebody die, so why are we so sad? So this is essentially what we're looking at today. What is loss? What do we consider to be loss? And then before we talk about grief, we have to define loss. Then we'll move on to what is grief? What is that process? Then we'll be looking at the challenges of unrecognized loss and unsupported grief, specifically in the context of organizational change. And then lastly, we're going to hopefully give you some tools or suggest some tools that you could use if you choose to incorporate this process into change management processes in your organization that you could build into your strategy. So regardless of whether change is positive or negative, we all lose something. Whether you get a promotion or whether you lose your position, it causes losses and it triggers the grieving process. And if it isn't understood and supported, it can lead to a whole host of negative consequences for individuals and for the organizations that they work with. So the question that I'd like to put to you today as you move through the material is, what would happen if we actually did incorporate this into our plans? So with that question, let's move on. On the next slide, you're going to see a whole list of losses. And these are losses that are very, very common for all humans. And I'd like you to take a look at the list and see which you identify. Now, you don't have to tell us because that can be very vulnerable for some people. But if you'd like to just take a note for yourself, which you have experienced, and you can share if you'd like, but you don't have to. So let's move on. So I'll give you a moment to take a look at this list, and there's a whole list, and these are just some of them. We'll have a look. Do you recognize any of these? For me, I have almost all of them. I have lost almost all of them at one point or another. I think it would be I haven't lost my homeland, but I did move. I immigrated, so I lost my culture and I lost the familiarity of the physical landscape that I lived in. And the rest of them, yeah, pretty much all of them. And I think it would be very unusual to come across an adult who hasn't experienced at least some of these. So thank you for those who are sharing. You'll notice that there are different kinds. There are ones that we can see and ones that maybe aren't so evident. For example, time is not so evident, but the loss of a career is. If you leave a job, everybody can see that you leave the job. A loss of respect is perhaps not so evident, but the loss of the loss of a work colleague is. So that begins to categorize losses. There are two types of losses. Paul, if you'd like to move on. There are two kinds of losses. There are tangible losses, the ones that everyone can see, the ones that the video camera can see. And those are ones like merger, acquisition, bankruptcy, retirement, reorganization. And then there are intangible losses, and those are ones that we can't see and that we may not understand. So there may be loss of confidence, loss of respect, loss of trust, loss of culture, loss of love, all sorts of things that are very personal to the individual, but may not be understood by their environment. Both losses are extremely personal to the individual. And what happens often is that they're disenfranchised. That means that other people wouldn't necessarily acknowledge them or understand them. And that leaves us feeling very lonely when they happen. So if we'd like to move on, in the organization, an example of tangible losses on the three different levels are new technology, or perhaps the old way of doing things. When Me Too became a really big thing, all of a sudden organizations had to revamp policies, and even if they didn't revamp policies, it meant they had to do things a little bit differently because that was expected, but it couldn't really be seen. It just meant a change of attitude and mindset. From a team perspective, you may have the team move to a new location. Even just different floors. If you move to the 5th floor from the 5th floor to the 10th floor, what does that mean? It's a tangible change. Intangible may be loss of recognition. Perhaps your team was up for an award and it didn't win the award. And what does that mean? What does that do to the overall morale of the team if they really expected that award and they didn't get it? On an individual level, a promotion is a tangible change, and it comes with its own set of losses, believe it or not. An intangible would be a loss of trust. If, I don't know, perhaps you made a mistake and you don't quite have that trust anymore from your teammates.
Jacqueline and I were talking about the three-pronged approach in relation to some of the organizational change experience that I've had. And again, this is when my eyes opened very clearly because I won't name the consulting firm, but it was one of the big four consulting firm that I was working for as a leader in one of the firms. And they had an internal project, and that project was a whole new office move, basically. So they were in their current existing place where they were in Alberta or in Edmonton was basically in a shopping mall basement, and you had people that had been working in this big four consulting firm in this basement for 25 years. So typical big four consulting firms: tax, finance, advisory, consulting. And there were a bunch of senior managers that were in the same office, believe it or not, the actual same office, with stacks of paper for 25 years, basically their whole career. And they were moving to this brand new, swanky kind of glass building in the downtown Edmonton core. And they were going to have 2 floors on the 19th and the 20th floor. And it was a complete new, paradigm shift for them. So I was asked, as part of my internal work with this consulting firm, to actually manage the change and of the project. So I did exactly what we would do with clients and organizations. And one of the things was to look at moving them from where they were to where they needed to be as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And of course, as cheaply as possible. So we wanted to make sure that we could do this in an expedited way. And by my own admission, I used all the tools that we're probably all familiar with in terms of handling stakeholder groups and resistance, and how to communicate with those groups and see if they're ready, and look at the impact analysis and look at what training they need. And you know something? The one thing that I didn't do was I didn't stop to put myself in their position. I didn't say to myself, how does Bob feel? He's started his whole career, and he's had his whole career in this organization, in this office. And now we're asking him to move to a new office structure, which, by the way, the whole concept of hoteling was just taking off then. So Bob was going to lose his office. He'd probably, if he had a wife and kids, he probably had some great experience. Like, he met his wife and he proposed to her, maybe he talked to her on the phone, his kid was born, he got a phone call in the office, whatever it happened to be. And I was taking Bob from that to an environment where he had an ergonomic desk, where he was going to be around a bunch of other senior managers, no privacy, no door. Oh, and the other thing was, we were going to take Bob's paperwork away, because we were going to actually make it a printerless, paperless office, right? And I completely didn't understand the experience of Bob, and there were hundreds of people like Bob. And so one of the things for me, like at the organizational level on this slide, the old way of doing things was changing. Now the organization was going to do something in a different way. At the team level, all of these senior managers, they were moving to a new location. They were feeling like they were losing their identity. These offices and the hierarchical structure, this is what defined them. And they felt I was actually quite unsympathetic. For those who know me, that's probably not it's actually quite true. I openly admit I hadn't been the most empathetic of the people, moving these people through from where they were to where they needed to be. And then at the individual level, no wonder they didn't trust me to have their interests at heart, because I didn't understand where they came from. I didn't understand the sense of loss that they were going to experience. And that's partly why I mentioned that this was a bit of a paradigm shift for me, because what would have happened if I had understood that, if I could truly have understood what they were losing? So that's kind of almost a segue into this next gray box that you're going to see.
Well, I think you can, before we go on, I think you can forgive yourself for that, though, Paul, because the majority of us will disenfranchise the losses of others, because look at what you're getting, this brand new office. Like, it's going to be so great. And we don't recognize or support the losses, because, that's just the old way of doing things. The new, bright, shiny way of doing things is so much better. But the point is, we need to stop and take a moment and say, this is what we're losing, for our brains to be able to switch to, this is what we're getting. So the worst thing you can do to another human being is invalidate what they're feeling. I think all of us who are coaches and all of us who work with people, will support that statement. The worst thing you can do is say what you feel and what you think does not matter. So this is the little piece that we're missing in the whole change management process. So let's move on.
Yeah, just before you do that, Nalia just said organizations tend to be indifferent and reluctant to acknowledge the intensity of loss felt by individuals.
Yep.
I completely agree.
And there's a good reason for that. We'll get into it a little bit later.
Okay. All right. So again, you've kind of got to know the way that we're going to run this session. So take some time to reflect on what you feel the organizations you've been part of have lost because of change. I'm sure many of you around this call have had similar experiences to the one I just outlined, with if you're supporting a client or if you're going through this change yourself in your own organization. Again, feel free to use the Zoom chat or unmute yourself, entirely up to you.
Yeah, just think of one change that you went through, and see if you can identify a couple of tangibles and intangibles that were lost.
Hi, this is Funke here. Just to add to what Paul was saying, there was a change I was part of in an organization I was working in, and basically it was changing to an open office kind of thing. And it was obvious that from the faces of people, they were losing that it's my space, as well as the fact that I cannot put up the pictures of my loved ones, as well as my certifications, and that became a big deal for a lot of people. And it was sad to see, but going back to Nyla's point, it's because it's about the bottom line. We need to quickly get this change going on and move on to the next thing. So it was recognized but not dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting, but if they had taken a bit of time, they might have found the change process easier, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
There's interesting comments here, Jacqueline. I don't know if you've been seeing some of the comments on the chat box, but to a culture of support, inclusion, and trust from Yvonne, in terms of what people feel that they've lost because of change. Penalized by management, pushing for demotion, terminations, etc.
It's really, Paul, can I take a minute and talk about negative emotions here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that, well, I'm human and you're all human, and we've been given a full spectrum of emotions to keep us alive, essentially. Every single one of those emotions has a purpose, an evolutionary function, in keeping us safe or keeping us alive. Anger protected our safety. Anxiety pushed us to be creative, to be problem solvers. And grief actually helped us transition from the old to the new. And what has happened through the scientific management method is the elimination of the humanity of the employee. So negative emotions like sadness, anger, frustration, anxiety take a lot more time to manage, and that costs money. It's inconvenient as well because nobody really knows how to support them. Think about a time when you've had somebody break down in tears in front of you, and what you say is, you know, what we're like, oh God, I just wish they would stop crying because I don't know what to do. And in reality, their bodies are having a reaction that they actually physiologically need to have in order to move on. And what very few people know is that profound emotional reactions like that, bouts of anger or crying jags, really only last about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. But in the organization, it disrupts the workflow. It creates disruption, distraction. No one knows how to support it. And by the way, employees aren't supposed to really have emotions. Plus, we live in this culture of toxic positivity where everybody has to find their bliss. And anything less than happiness and positivity is punished. But paradoxically, we're all working toward psychologically safe workplaces and employee engagement and humanizing the workplace. But we're actually not allowing half of our humanity to show up in the workplace because it's inconvenient.
Yeah, Jacqueline, this chat box is blowing up in terms of people's comments. It's amazing. Myra,
I'm not watching the chat box. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Thank you.
well, everything you're talking about and that we're alluding to is coming up. You know, what drives resistance tends to be the losses that people are not sharing and communicating. SD, many workplaces don't want to bring forward their whole human selves into the workplace. Many companies reward leaders who only project happiness and confidence and egos. It takes longer to not manage those emotions. Great point, Dave. You know, in terms of a bigger cost to the bottom line to not managing those emotions. This is the kind of stuff that to me as a practitioner shows that we need to get this stuff out more into the world that we work in terms of organizational change.
Exactly, especially when we consider that such a high percentage of change initiatives fail or don't meet their intended outcomes, which means that they cost more, they take longer, there's less engagement, there's less adoption. So again, I come back to the question, what would happen if we took a couple of days to deal with the detachment or the letting go of the attachment to the old state? And that's a rhetorical question at this point. So, so moving on. Thank you, Paul. So let's take a look at what happens to our brains as human beings during change. So interestingly, what happens to the brain during change is the same as what happens to the brain when it's in pain. And this is well researched. So a brain will light up the same way if it's faced with a change as it will if it's in pain. So essentially what happens is that our brain goes into survival mode. And that means that we get an amygdala hijack. Essentially, we go into fight, flight, freeze, or fold. When that happens, our ability to be creative and to problem solve and to think creatively diminishes. It drastically decreases because all we can think about is surviving. We want to protect ourselves. And that's the only thing that the brain is into. So what happens, do you think, if a person is in survival mode and you're pushing them toward the bright, shiny new thing? What happens? And I'm asking the group.
You get angry.
You can get angry. What else?
You could disengage.
Do you think that's where resistance shows up? No, I'm not. I want to protect myself. I'm not going to the bright, shiny new thing. I'm going to stay where I am because I don't know about the bright, shiny new thing.
Yeah, fear, discomfort, burnout, breakdown, these all being popping up in the chat box. Massive secret ongoing resistance. People take sick leave.
So you've got a whole bunch of people in survival mode and you're pushing them to the bright, shiny new thing. That's what we've historically done. Now, what's interesting though, not everybody will react the same way. It depends on the attachment that we have as individuals to the previous state. And that's extremely, extremely individualistic. So everyone reacts to change differently. Everyone will experience different losses, although there may be buckets of losses for certain changes. So a lot of people will feel that they lost respect or they lost identity, but it's extremely individualistic. If we could move on, please.
Oh yeah. Well, I was just going to say the experience then I had with the senior managers in this consulting firm. For what was happening in terms of what they lost, they were losing their status quo, and the uncertainty of it, what they were losing and where they were going to. I, as a practitioner, didn't necessarily understand that fully. So I wish I'd known you, Jacqueline, then, basically.
Well, I would have been able to support it, I think, a little bit. Maybe not pro bono, but anyway. So we can see very clearly change is painful because it brings on uncertainty. We don't know exactly what's happening, but we know we have to let go of the past. Our brains don't like uncertainty because they're kind of lazy and they don't like having to work to figure out new situations. They like the status quo. So that uncertainty begets anxiety. And anxiety is a situation or is a state that can manifest as anger and frustration and sadness and apathy and all these wonderful things, including resistance. So that anxiety, if it's not supported, translates into negative behaviors that were just mentioned in the previous slide, and resistance. Or, and this is the actual evolutionary function of anxiety, it can stimulate creativity. Now, if someone had told me 10 years ago that the fact that I was anxious all the time meant that I needed to drive myself forward into a new state, I would have called them absolutely freaking crazy. I medicated myself and did absolutely everything to avoid feeling anxious. But when you start looking at why we experience anxiety as human beings, it's actually to alert us to the fact that the old state is no longer acceptable or safe. And we have to figure out a new way of doing things. And that's why grief is actually one of the most creative phases in a human life. When you take a look, and thank you for whoever mentioned Bridges, when you take a look at Bridges' model of organizational change, and most of you will be familiar with this, it's a three-phase model. It's not linear. We begin with letting go. We begin with an ending. The old state is no longer the way things are going to be. We need to let go. We then transition into the neutral zone. And this is a highly creative experimental phase where people will sort of oscillate between considering the opportunities of the new beginning and really wanting to stay put where they were because that was comfortable. So some people go through this more quickly than others, and some people go through spend a lot of time in the neutral zone. Some people may spend a lot of time in the ending. Some people get stuck. And some people may waltz into the new beginning very quickly. Now, why I put these two models up is because the one is a model of organizational change that we all know. Most of us know, sorry for the non-OCM people here. What's interesting is that the model on the right is called the dual processing model of grief. And if it was on an angle, it would be the Bridges model. What you see on the left is loss orientation. This is the ending, the letting go. This means the old state is no longer where we are. Then we move into the middle of oscillating between accepting the new and staying stuck in the old. And then the oval on the right is restoration orientation, which is where we have adapted and adopted the new situation. This was, for me, the most profound moment when I realized that Bridges' model of change and the dual processing model of grieving meant that we really needed to honor loss and grief in the change process, and nobody was talking about it. Was this perhaps why so many changes failed? So if we'd like to move on, are there any questions at this point, actually? Okay, let's move on then. So at this point, we've learned that there are two types of losses, tangible and intangible losses. We've learned that change, regardless of whether it's positive or negative, begets loss. And loss triggers grief. And grief is a critical physiological adaptive process that all humans go through before they can let go of the olds and adopt the new. But the grieving takes time. And when we push people toward the new, bright, shiny thing too quickly, a number of things happen. And those things do not support effective organizational change. Paul, what have you seen happen?
I'll just take you off mute there. I've seen, like, so on this slide, the toxicity. So for instance, I do a lot of work with leadership teams and moving them from, you know, where they are as a team to where they want to be champions and ambassadors of the change. In fact, someone around this call who shall remain nameless, but you know who I am referring to, we worked on a recent project about a year ago, and we stumbled upon this very top issue of toxicity with the leader in our client organization. And we couldn't move this person from where they were to where they needed to be, and their whole organization also needed them to be, and they acknowledged that they needed to be there as well. They couldn't let go of the old, and it was all wrapped up in their sense of identity with their leadership title, with their the status of being a leader, and kind of diversifying that and delegating that down to their leadership team. They couldn't let go. They couldn't let go. We didn't, and the person who's around this table knows what I'm about to say. In a workshop that we worked with this leader on, imagine, person in the audience who I'm not going to name, if we had had this understanding of, I'll call him John, when we were doing, not John's, not the guy on the call, let's say the fictitious client. Imagine if we'd understood John at this point in terms of what John didn't want to let go of as a leader. We would have moved him through the process of change a lot quicker. Similarly, with, you know, when Jacqueline said we're trying to move someone to this shiny, bright object as quickly as possible, we're not taking the time to understand, like, how, I mean, many of you have probably heard of the term change fatigue, change saturation. We're not taking the time to understand this is just another change coming to them, and they're overwhelmed and they can't actually accommodate and assimilate everything that's happening. So as a result, what happens is they become less productive. And I've seen this happen many times. And then that moves to all sorts of discussions on lack of performance, and then the impact of that on the morale of the team. We waste a lot of time. And also at the organizational level, significant investment is made into transformation. Think about the lack of return on investment. That, you know, we're throwing away opportunities to better understand our stakeholders as they're going through change. And for me, that was the missing piece. And so I've seen it play out in all sorts of environments over my career. And I just never had a name for it until now, really. So how many others have seen that? Yeah, how many others around the table have seen that in terms of some of those things I've mentioned?
Absolutely, Paul. I used to work for Canada Trust, and when TD Bank bought us out, there was about a period about a year where we lost our best people, and no one ever talked about it. Our best people, and these were all professional people managers. You could at Canada Trust, you couldn't work with people. You couldn't get a promotion unless you went through their 1-year people management program and be part of the internal network, coast to coast of. They had a managers network of community practice, but it was just like the most somber experience, and there was no support. It was crazy. It was like 20 years ago.
Thank you.
But again,
Thank you
it's forgivable because we have historically, as a society, not recognized loss or grief outside of the context of bereavement. You know, we have rules around how long people can grieve, what they can grieve, how they can grieve, what's considered a loss. And it wasn't in organizational change or in the context of organizations. Grief and loss actually weren't researched until 2 years ago.
And then, you know, I know that a lot of us around the call are familiar with the statistics available that say, you know, the change failure rate, you know, the 70% thing that I think has actually been debunked now in many contexts. But as a practitioner, I think about this, the waste of time spent on transformation, because we're not creating the foundation for this to be sustainable. And I wonder, just open question, if we had an approach to understanding organizational change as well as the resistance that stakeholders demonstrate through this lens, I wonder if we create a more human-centric organization to allow the space for this to come out, how sustainable would such transformations be? And I guess that's just a rhetorical question as well, but it's maybe something for us to think about, because ever since I've been, my eyes have been open to this stuff. I've been thinking about, my Rolodex of projects that I've been involved in, how many would have been really sustainable, and also my future projects. What am I going to do differently as I move forward now knowing this stuff to supporting clients and organizations in the future? So.
Well, if this approach is, if time and space is made for grieving, the overall impact is predictably increased empathy, because we understand what grief is, and that everyone changes or grieves differently. Everyone has their own grief fingerprint, as it were. Increased change resilience, because people are now practiced at letting go of attachments and adopting new ones. And less resistance, which translates into less cost, right? It decreases the cost of organizational change.
So it's interesting, because what we're talking about is alluding to the behaviours that turn up as well in some of the chat box feedback and some of the conversation. And as you've taken us through this journey, Jacqueline, we're seeing grief's triggered because of loss, and then loss can result in certain types of behaviours. So we did a quick Wordle for those that can see on the screen. And I know, Jacqueline, you've got something to say about this as well, about what underpins these whole behaviours. I think that one of the things that was an aha moment for me is that I've seen all of these behaviours show up. And yet, from the traditional lens of a change practitioner, I've been trying to move them through as quickly as possible, whilst understanding where they're at surface level, but trying to get them to the next juncture. So what are your thoughts on what underpins this in terms of what leads to these behaviors?
Well, anxiety. Anxiety causes all of this. And as organizational change practitioners, we can either ignore the anxiety and disenfranchise the losses, or we can learn to leverage it. We can learn to use it and move things along a lot faster, actually more effectively, and at less cost. And create more resilient, more empathetic, more creative organizations, more innovative organizations.
Just thinking in terms of the time, I know we want to keep on time as much as possible, and then I'm getting a little thumbs up from Rich saying we're okay.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, cool. Because one of the things, again, as a practitioner, I'm reflecting on is how does grief show up with my client base in terms of their behaviors. I'd be really interested, and I think we'd like to maybe get some chat box thoughts, if you're willing to share. How does grief show up with your organizations in terms of the behaviors that you see, given the context of everything we've talked about? Just like throw some bullet points out on the chat box, because this is where the rubber hits the road, as it were, in terms of people's behaviors. Silence. As in that was an entry from Nadia. Silence. Disengagement, sabotage, bullying, anger. Yeah.
Desertion is another one. A lot of really good people have left because they've felt their grief their losses haven't been acknowledged, and their grief hasn't been supported.
Giving up. Aggression. That's a good one. Aggression.
Yeah. It seems a little trite to say that the answer is as simple as sitting with someone and going through a loss inventory, helping them identify what their losses are, because most of us can't even name what we're losing because we don't have the vocabulary for it. and saying, you know what, that really sucked, to validate.
Well, that's a good segue into this slide almost, because, you know, so many of us are used to a number of these models and others, I'm sure. And by the way, I know there's so many people around this call that would like to talk about the pros or the cons of every one of these. We're not here to do that.
That's another call.
That's another call. And, you know, we all have our preferences, and we all bespoke them, of course. I think the point here is that pretty much all of these models, these methods, frameworks, whatever you want to call them, they all focus on moving towards the change ASAP. And what we're finding is that they don't allow the time to really process those losses. They don't recognize the losses. They don't allow for the emotional responses for grief. Grieving, as we talked about it before with Jacqueline's comments around it being disenfranchised, it's also suppressed and solidified. So, and in my experience of using I've used every single one of these models, methods, whatever you want to call them, on this page, and I've never seen anything. Great point, SD. Models are very focused on results and not allow for focus on people component. Couldn't agree more. And I find now, with this knowledge, as well as the knowledge of these tools and methods that we've used, that we have a responsibility. Actually, we have almost an obligation, or I feel like I do, to when I go and support clients in the future, to look at how loss and grief can help me as I'm moving them through. Because instead of just focusing on getting them from A to B, or then the quick adoption and all the buzzwords that we use, you know, the action process orientated steps that we take, let's just slow down. Let's take a little bit more time to have a conversation with everyone. Now, those in the audience might be thinking, well, that's going to cost a lot of money. It's too much. We can't do all that. But, you know, let's kind of look at the next slide. You're all aware of these types of tools that we use in change, right? Now, what's missing from here is the leadership card, the leadership set of tools that we tend to use, leadership alignment plans, the leadership alignment coaching. There's a whole myriad of this stuff, right? There's so many, there's thousands of different. Oh, this presentation reminds me of saying facts alone cannot change minds and behaviors. We need feelings too. Fantastic. Great point, Minnie. Great point. And how many of us actually do, when we administer these tools, think about that? If we're honest, right? If we're really honest, and I'm being completely honest, I've not always thought about that. I've just wanted to get them from A to B. Of course, being human in the process, but has it really been human? And despite all of this stuff, we use all these tools, and we've still got high levels of dissatisfaction with people going through change. We've still got high levels of resistance. We've still got those tabloid-worthy failure rate statistics for change. We've still got like millions being invested in change, and we're all part of it. But I'm really curious, what would happen if we did have a range of different loss and grief tools? How would that impact all of the work that we're doing? And that's almost, again, a good segue, not to focus on the Kubler-Ross model here. But Jacqueline, I wonder if you could kind of like give us some thoughts around this in terms of...
I can. So Kubler-Ross has been recognized. The Kubler-Ross was never meant to be used outside of the context of a terminal illness. So let that be said. It's actually been debunked as a grieving model as well. But it's what we recognize as organizational change practitioners. It has been used as a model for human response to change. So this is where we're starting. The common understanding is that we all go through this model, which is linear, although it's been proven there's nothing linear about the change process, and we can be in any stage at any time. It does speak to the fact, again, that grieving is extremely individualistic, and it's unpredictable because we don't know how long anyone will be in any particular stage. What we tend to do, again, is move people along to ignore the beginning, or there are a number of research papers that I've looked at that said, do not allow people to sit in the past, move them to the future as quickly as possible. Bang through that wall of resistance. What's really interesting is that since then there's been research that shows that people don't actually resist the change itself. They are resistant to the pain that accompanies the loss of attachment to the old state. So you can talk about the benefits of the new bright shiny thing as much as you want, but that's not what they're resisting.
So Jacqueline, there's been a good question from Adelma. Is grief something that can be supported as a group, or is it more of a private individual process?
I think that it can be supported as a group, especially if you use a tool like a loss inventory to really take note of what people are, what people are losing. And then based on the loss inventory, there can be buckets of different losses. So based on that information, that data, you can develop a grief plan, which may include a ritual, like a funeral for a tech system or something that everyone on the team can participate in and collectively share their thoughts. It is an individual process as well, though, and there are other tools for that. Can we move on, Paul, or?
Well, yeah, I was thinking, did we want to poll people quickly, or is this more of a reflective question for?
I think just given the interest of time, I think
we've got about 10 minutes. I think we've got about 10 minutes.
Okay.
8 minutes because we started at 18 minutes past.
Right. Well, okay, let's do a very quick poll. Given what you know now about the necessity of grieving to the human in a change process, how likely, oh no, we're going to do that at the end. Never mind.
Yeah, no, we're just going to see what people's thoughts are, where they see the opportunity as part of the grief process. Jacqueline, are you? Oh,
sorry, I was reading the chat box. See, I told you I couldn't multitask.
You froze it. Well, I won't understand how that's affecting you because I'll just try and move you from A to B as quickly as I can.
You know what? Let's just move on.
Yeah. Well, but it is interesting. I think like maybe it's a reflective question after the session. Is now you've heard a bunch of material in a very rapid fire way. Maybe take some time on your own to reflect and think. Where do you see the opportunity now to help organizations through the grief process? Now that you've got this kind of toe dip into this topic.
Yeah, like when you think about the change that you thought of earlier, the organizational change when you were identifying losses, think about where supporting grief might have been helpful in that process. And there are quite a number of tools actually that can support the grieving process in organizations, both on an individual and a collective level or a team level. Now, I'm not going to go through each one individually. I would like to pull out the ones that are in darker blue, because these are the ones that are most often cited in the research as being effective in supporting the grieving process. Now, do keep in mind, grieving process not necessarily in the context of organizational change, but the grieving process in the context of non-death losses. So not in the context of bereavement, not in the context of organizational change yet. That's what my dissertation is going to be about, but non-death losses. So all of you did sort of an informal loss inventory. And a loss inventory is an overview of what people are experiencing as a loss in the change. Companioning, when you look at the description of companioning, the coaches among you will really appreciate this, but the research in thanatology talks about companioning. What they're describing is coaching according to the ICF principles and competencies. So coaching has been effective in supporting people through non-death losses. What has historically happened is that non-death losses have been treated by counselors and therapists and pathologized rather than supported in the context of a loss. So even as counselors, the role of grief is not understood, is not well understood. But as coaches, I'm giving you a leg up. Companioning is the key to supporting grief and organizational change. Mindfulness, Jordan, again, I have to thank you for turning me on to meditation. Mindfulness has been extremely effective. A grief map is the totality, or a grief plan is the totality of tools that you're going to be using to support the grieving process in your organization or for an individual. This goes hand in hand with the Grief Fingerprint, which is not on here, but a Grief Fingerprint is the how one responds to losses, what losses one responds to, and how one grieves. So everyone will grieve differently. I grieve differently than Paul. Paul grieves differently than Rich. We all process grief or process change differently. So the Grief Fingerprint is that. The Grief Plan is the totality of tools that you're going to be using to support the grieving process. Rituals, I did mention the funeral. That sounds a little wacky. Rich actually has done a funeral in an organization. We won't get into that now, but there are rituals. Rituals are really one of the more effective effective methods to get a human to transition from one state to another. Think about how powerful it is to walk down that aisle when you get married, or to stick the baby seat in the back of your car when you bring home your baby for the first time. Those are rituals. So and then change intelligence, which is a tool that was developed by my friend Barbara Troutline, Dr. Troutline, that helps people understand who they are and how they are in change situations.
Jacqueline,
creepy. It's not that creepy.
Reg was calling out the rituals and recognition as well for leaders. Yes. Really important for leaders to have that process. And others were saying creating a safe space. And I think it was Yvonne saying sponsorship from leadership is key. None of this will happen without sponsorship. Absolutely. And the buy-in. So, I'm just curious, as we go back to our own organizations and clients and everything like that, maybe there's an opportunity to start thinking at that leadership level. Where are the actual opportunities to have this safe kind of conversation?
Exactly. And just to speak to the funeral comment about the funeral being creepy, a funeral is just a very commonly understood ritual that we are all familiar with, but they don't have to be creepy. It's just a celebration and acknowledgement where we honor the past, take a piece of the past with us, and embrace the future. Awake. Sure, I'll call it awake. That's only one example though, Rich.
And with some of these tools, particularly, I know the next slide, we'll just single out two of these tools, and in the interest of time, we'll probably, because we've covered a lot of this as well. The loss inventory, for instance, I'm sure a lot of us around the table have done many change readiness assessments or change impact analyses. If we could take some 3 to 5 questions from a loss inventory, once we get that data, we're much better able to understand how to engage that particular person. So think about it.
People.
Yeah, so if we understood that, we can then structure our communications, our key messages, our stakeholder engagement strategy, whatever we want to call it, and from the models we use, to then serve that person a bit better. And think about it, the only difference, or the only cost to that is being open to have the discussion around how do we integrate these types of tools or components of them into what we already use in the change context. The same with the grief map. I've developed for clients, roadmaps on how they're going to start the change, go from A all the way to Z. Imagine what it would look like if we had elements of what a grief map contains as part of that trajectory for them. And that and imagine even further, if you will, when, because we all talk about, and you said it in the chat box, leadership alignment is key, getting the leaders on board. Now imagine when you do one-on-one leader coaching and group leader coaching, if you created a safe space for them to be authentic in how they expressed the loss and the grief. Imagine if I'd done that with the senior managers that had lost their offices. Imagine if I'd done that before I then went up to them and said, oh, you're this stakeholder group, you're in that quadrant, therefore you need these things to communicate with you, and this is my strategy to do it. I think the opportunities here are endless in terms of how we integrate. So some real good stuff coming out of this. So, Jacqueline,
I've already spoken to the loss inventory and to the grief map.
Yeah.
So if anyone has questions about any of those tools, our contact information is at the end of the presentation. But moving forward, we would like to talk to, Dr. Troutline is in the group. Hi, Barbara. Yes, I'm so glad you're here. Now I'm a little intimidated, just a tick. All right, so we're going to put out a call to action, actually, to ask you as practitioners, and even if you're not practitioners, this information is relevant to any changes in any human's life. How can the loss and grief tools support you in understanding anxiety and your negative emotions, reactions to change, including resistance, that you could potentially implement in your organization or in your lives? And go ahead, Paul.
Well, I'm thinking, because I'm excited about this next piece as well, because as we do that, and as we get people to start thinking about the role that loss and grief tools can play, I think one of the things that will be amazing is to create some sort of ecosystem, so some sort of environment to get people to actually share their experiences, what worked, what didn't work, how can we further build this environment. So I think one of the reasons of doing this was to actually to introduce a new concept, pretty much, to most of us, and then to actually challenge us to go out and try this with our own environments, and then come back and tell us how you did. Did it work? Did it help? What would you like to see? And I think we've got such an amazing opportunity and platform here to do that. So that's kind of our call to action, really. Try the tools, see how they work for you, tell us about your experiences, really.
And in developing the tools, both of us are here at any time to support you in that. And we don't have, because grieving is such an individual process, an individual to the organization, unique to the organization as well, we would take whatever situation you're looking at and develop something that's tailored to the organization so that it's entirely relevant to you and to the individuals that you're working with. So if you have questions for us, or if you'd like to explore any of this further, please feel free to get in touch with us. You can get me at my email address, or Paul, LinkedIn, and we'll be around for a while. Those of you who have my number or Paul's number, feel free to text as well.
And before we go, we'd like you to, in the spirit of using technology, to get your thoughts. I've never done this before, so
don't go yet.
Don't go yet. I'm going to ask you, from a polling perspective, how likely are you to look at organizational change differently from now on? And I'm going to launch the poll in a minute. Jeff is going to help me figure out how long to keep it up for, but very unlikely, neutral, likely, or very likely. And just give us your answers in the poll. I should be able to share that now. All right, launch polling.
Yeah, I'd love to see what the answers are.
There we go. It's in process. Oh. We've had 12 of the 18 people vote.
It's coming. 13, 14.
Now we've had 14.
This is very cool, Rich. This is a great feature.
This is a pretty cool feature, yeah. 15. We have 83% of the vote. Can we get 88? Can we get two more?
2 more.
Just two more. Run, Forrest, run. We
I
just
think-
17. One more.
Come on, don't be the odd one out. No, I think it's going to stay at 17.
Okay, excellent.
Well,
So
that's really cool.
yeah, 59% are likely, 6% very likely, and 12% neutral. Great results.
That's amazing.
Yeah, excellent. I'll keep that up. End polling. Okay, and that, shall I share the results, Rich? You want me to keep? Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
A visual is always nicer for people to see.
Can you see that?
You could vote twice, Yvonne.
Excellent. And that pretty much is everything we've got, isn't it, Jacqueline?
That's pretty much it. I've got, I could talk all night, but I don't want to bore you. And I think that requires a bottle of wine.
I don't think it would be boring at all. I think, but I get the passion that you're demonstrating here, and how much further you could take with this. And I really appreciate you both with your conversation and your insights and everything on this. It's an interesting topic, because I want to say it's a great topic, but I also recognize the challenges of it being a topic that's being explored as well. So thank you for also having the courage to bring this into the space as well, because it's a good stuff and everything like that. So thank you very much for your time. If you want to pop up your email address and stuff as well at the end, just in case there's anybody missing or anything like that as well, just so if anybody wants to reach out to you, they can do so, because we are tight on time. So I appreciate that we possibly have 3,000 more questions that want to be directed at you. So we can get that done at a later point in time. So thank you very much. Yeah. Appreciate your time. That was a rising finale to our series. So really good. So appreciate that. Thank you very much, everybody. So I'm going to